Let's step right into the living, breathing, and honestly, deeply uncertain world of the American Civil War. We're going to move far beyond the textbook dates and the marble statues here. Instead, in this explainer, we're diving into the desperate human choices, the towering gambles, and the invisible economic forces that literally fractured a nation. This is the story of a society tearing itself apart from the inside out, where every single decision carried civilization-altering consequences. Picture it. It's 1861. The United States is staring down the absolute greatest crisis in its short history. But you really have to understand something right off the bat. This devastating outcome, it was never inevitable. It was the explosive result of decades of individual decisions, political systems, and economic incentives violently crashing into one another. So how exactly did a nation built on constitutional compromise shatter so spectacularly into the bloodiest conflict in its history? Part 1. The Antebellum Chasm. Two incompatible worlds. To wrap our heads around this collapse, we have to look at how the North and South had effectively evolved into two entirely different civilizations. On one side, you've got the North. Think of an emerging industrial powerhouse, roaring with free labor, fueled by massive European immigration, and just incredibly rich in natural resources. Now, look at the other side. The South was a distinctly agrarian society, and its entire economy, its culture, its political power, the whole shebang was wholly dependent on the brutal reality of chattel slavery. It was a complete collision course of competing human and economic systems, where each side essentially viewed the other as an existential threat to its very way of life. Now, for decades, politicians desperately tried to patch this growing chasm with these incredibly fragile compromises over Western territories. But bandages can only hold so much. The real tipping point finally arrived at the 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln. He was the first Republican president, and he ran on an explicitly anti-slavery platform. Driven by this intense, existential, psychological fear of losing their entire slave labor system, 11 southern states seceded, starting with South Carolina. And by April 1861, that tense political standoff exploded into open, terrifying warfare when Confederate batteries opened fire on the federal garrison at Fort Sumter. Part 2. The High-Stakes Gamble, September 1862. Okay, so we're into 1862, and the war hasn't ended quickly like so many people naively thought it would. The scale of the violence is just escalating out of control. So Confederate General Robert E. Lee makes this desperate, incredibly high-stakes gamble to invade Maryland. And we have to recognize that this wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a profound political calculation. See, Lee knew the South fundamentally couldn't survive a long war of attrition. He believed the Confederacy's absolute best hope rested on breaking Northern morale right then and there. With Northern midterm elections coming up, and both Britain and France watching super closely to see if they should officially recognize the Confederacy, Lee crossed into Union territory. He's hoping a decisive victory on Northern soil will empower the anti-war party and literally force Lincoln to the negotiating table. This massive gamble culminates near Sharpsburg, Maryland, right along Antietam Creek. And the human destruction that followed is almost beyond comprehension. We're talking over 22,700 casualties in just 12 hours of combat. Let that sink in. To this very day, it remains the bloodiest single day in American military history. We really have to pause here and put ourselves in that terrifying environment. Union and Confederate forces were just sweeping back and forth across Miller's cornfield and the West Woods, fighting to this horrifying standstill. One observer actually wrote that every stalk of corn in the northern and greater part of the field was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, with the slain soldiers lying in rows exactly as they had stood just moments before. It was an apocalyptic scene, completely drowned out by the deafening roar of 150,000 muskets and over 200 cannons. So technically, the battle was a tactical draw, and Lee manages to slip back across the Potomac River. Union General George McClellan had a severe case of what Lincoln notoriously called the slows. He completely failed to pursue and destroy Lee's battered army, which ultimately got him relieved of his command. But Lincoln did get the strategic victory he so desperately needed. Sure, Lee's army survived Antietam, but the real question was, could the Confederacy survive Lincoln's next stroke of the pen? Part 3. A War for Freedom. The radical shift? Because just days after Antietam, Lincoln seizes the moment and issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Now, initially, as a military measure, it only applied to states currently in rebellion, meaning it didn't instantly end slavery everywhere with a wave of wand. But the psychological and political impact of this, it was absolutely seismic. The Union Army was no longer just fighting to restore the old borders on a map. They were fundamentally rewriting the nation's core purpose, transforming into an army of liberation.
From that moment on, every single advance of federal troops actively expanded the domain of freedom.
And there's a crucial piece of this. The proclamation also announced the formal acceptance of Black men into the Union armed forces. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 Black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union. These historically marginalized voices stepped up as active armed agents in their own liberation. They took history right into their own hands, adding this immense moral and obviously military force to the Union cause.
But, of course, this fight for freedom carried a truly agonizing cost. Of the roughly 40,000 Black soldiers who died during the war, a staggering 30,000 perished, not from Confederate bullets, but from infection and disease. It's a harsh, sobering testament to the brutal, vastly unequal conditions of the Army camps, and it highlights the ultimate devastating price paid by these incredibly brave men fighting for a nation that didn't even fully recognize them as citizens yet.
Part 4. The Second Front. The Hidden Actors.
Now, while generals like Grant and Lee totally dominate the history books, the actual course of this war was profoundly shaped by hidden actors on the home front, specifically women across all classes. Take Clara Barton, for instance. Up north, untrained volunteers were completely shattering societal norms. At Antietam, when the military surgeons were desperately tearing up the last bed sheets in a farmhouse to use for bandages, Barton bravely drove her own cart of medical supplies directly into the fray. A surgeon right there on the scene remarked that all the generals actually sank into insignificance beside her. She didn't sit around waiting for permission, she simply acted, and as you might know, eventually went on to found the American Red Cross.
Down in the South, enslaved women were actively dismantling the institution of slavery from the inside out. Women like Harriet Jacobs, along with thousands of others whose names are tragically lost to history, forced the issue of freedom. They fled to Union lines. They worked as spies, as nurses, as teachers in refugee camps. By simply refusing to work for their enslavers, they crippled the Confederate economy and directly aided the Union war effort, very often enduring brutal beatings or even death for their defiance. They were, quite literally, the architects of their own emancipation. And for poor and working-class white Southern women, the war brought unimaginable severe starvation. Left behind to manage failing farms and face extreme poverty, these women launched what was essentially a second front of internal rebellion. They actually marched in the streets carrying signs demanding bread or blood, insisting the Confederate parliament step up and feed them. They wrote desperate, heartbreaking letters to their husbands and fathers in the army, which effectively forced massive waves of desertion. So this wasn't just some background home front issue. This internal economic and social collapse actively crippled the Confederacy's ability to keep an army in the field. Part 5. The Twin Turning Points. July 1863.
All of this mounting internal pressure finally explodes into a weekend of maximum tension in July of 1863. Up in Pennsylvania, Robert E. Lee's second massive invasion of the North is halted at the bloody three-day Battle of Gettysburg, leaving over 50,000 casualties in its wake. Then, literally the very next day, July 4th, the supposedly impenetrable Confederate fortress of Vicksburg, Mississippi, surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant after an absolutely grueling 47-day siege. In a matter of mere hours, the relentless momentum of history shifted, and the entire trajectory of the war was irrevocably altered. These twin victories delivered a fatal, dual blow to the South. Strategically speaking, Gettysburg totally crushed Lee's hopes of European intervention and ended any further northern invasions, while Vicksburg physically severed the Confederacy right down the middle, securing the crucial Mississippi River for the Union. And economically, Southern supply lines were completely devastated, while struggling northern farmers in the Ohio River Valley could finally transport their goods to market again. It secured Lincoln's re-election, it elevated Grant to commander of all Union forces, and honestly, it pretty much sealed the Confederacy's fate.
Part 6. The Unfinished Reconstruction, a New Nation. The grinding war of attrition continued until Lee finally surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. But, as we know, the end of the battlefield combat was really just the beginning of another long, incredibly difficult struggle. The 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery nationwide, but the country was entirely unprepared for the sheer chaos and the massive sudden vacuum of power that followed. During the Reconstruction era, African Americans eagerly pushed for education, for land, and for voting rights. You'd literally see grandfathers sitting right next to their grandchildren in classrooms just to learn how to read. Yet, this amazing progress was met with fierce, violent, and deeply hostile resistance from opponents desperate to erode every single hard-won gain.
To truly grasp the raw, emotional reality of this era, you have to listen to this poignant account from Freedman Houston Hartsfield Holloway. He wrote,
For we colored people did not know how to be free, and the white people did not know how to have a free colored person about them. That right there, that perfectly captures the incredibly chaotic and deeply fractured society left in the wake of the war. The American Civil War was an absolute crucible that fundamentally remade the United States. It preserved the nation, and it destroyed the vile institution of chattel slavery. But as we look back at the messy, highly contested aftermath of Reconstruction, we're left with this lingering, vital thought. The war shattered the physical chains of slavery, but what would be the true centuries-long cost of securing full citizenship in a supposedly reunited America? That is a definitive question the nation would spend the next century and a half trying to answer.